I've argued with many Jordan Peterson fans over the years, and there's one complaint every single one of them, from the hardcore to the supposedly moderate ones, all seem to share. They'll say that, oh, sure, even if Jordan Peterson says a lot of stuff that might seem blatantly offensive, politically partisan, and maybe even stupid, how come you critics never talk about the non-controversial things he says? I mean, not everything he says is terrible. In fact, there's a lot of stuff that he says that's just completely innocuous and basic common sense. And one of the top examples of those supposed uncontroversial things that they always go to is rule number 6 in Jordan Peterson's 2018 book, 12 Rules for Life. And that rule is, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, or more commonly known as the clean your room rule. Now, at first glance, this doesn't seem particularly controversial. In fact, to hear Peterson talk about it seems like one of the most reasonable things in the world.
So the pathway towards adopting individual responsibility happens to be a very individual one. But I do believe that the best bet for most people is to solve the problems that beset them in their own lives, the ethical problems that beset them, that they know are problems, and that they can set themselves together well enough so that they can then become capable of addressing larger scale problems without falling prey to some of the errors that characterize, let's say, over-optimistic and intellectually arrogant ideologues.
I mean, I've suggested to people that they start by putting their room in order, and that implies a purpose. It's like, well, your room is somewhere that you exist. It's a place that surrounds you, that tells you how to be. Put it in order, so at least it isn't screaming chaos at you in a soul-destroying manner. You can transform your whole household by transforming your room. You can transform your whole neighborhood by transforming your house. Like, these things spread very, very rapidly. And that is right there in front of you.
Start off doing smaller and more menial things before you can do much larger and more important things. If you can't clean your room, then how can you attempt to change the world? And if it was just that, just simply slowly building your way up to doing larger and more significant things, really nobody would have cared. If I wanted to be really picky, I could probably dig a bit deeper and offer some minor quibbles with it, but overall, I really wouldn't have given it too much thought. And I certainly wouldn't have bothered to make a fairly long video about it. But as is unfortunately quite consistently the case with Peterson, it's never that simple and never that uncontroversial with him. And this rule is no exception. So let's get to it. For starters, there's one word in that particular rule that I take issue with almost immediately. And that is the word perfect. That word is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Because how can you literally set your house, or any house for that matter, in perfect order? Like, okay, if you see, a bunch of clothes on the ground in your bedroom, yeah, you can pick them up and hang them in the closet or put them in the dresser or whatever. If you got garbage laying about, then yeah, throwing it away is easy enough. But what if, say, my window has a tiny crack in it? A crack that's not big enough to let air in, that functionally doesn't cause me any problems, but just doesn't seem very sightly. Does that need to be addressed? What about if your desk is, say, really dusty? Yeah, you can wipe it away, but it's going to get dusty again, right? So because it'll get dusty again, does this mean I can't go out and change the world until I can somehow find a way to make sure my desk stays dust-free? Similarly, I can mop up my kitchen and bathroom floors, but once again, they'll get dirty after not too long as well. Do you see where I'm going with this? It seems that no matter how hard one tries to get their house in perfect order, it will never achieve a state of being absolutely perfect. And if it somehow miraculously does get to such a state, then it won't take very much time for it to go back to being imperfect again. Now at this point, you're probably thinking that I'm taking this way too far. Of course, Peterson doesn't mean literally perfect. He doesn't mean perfect. Surely perfect is just a figure of speech, a term of art, as it were. But for many of the Peterson fans that I've spoken to, they think it's pretty obvious when Peterson says perfect, he just means good enough. If that's the case, then okay, fine, fair enough. Though I would expect a little bit better from Jordan, be precise in your speech, Peterson. So yeah, again, if that were the case, and I wouldn't take much issue with it. Except there's two problems here. When Peterson uses certain words, he always uses them specifically with a purpose. And in this case, he makes sure to emphasize the word perfect. And in this context, that's not just a suggestion. It's basically a demand. I don't know about you guys, but I don't usually emphasize any words that don't serve a purpose of, well, being emphasized. If you still think I'm being unfair to him, and that there's no way he means what I think he does, then fine. Hear it straight from the lobster's mouth. And to do that, we'll go directly to his book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. I tried to read the chapter in Jordan's book to see if I was being unfair to him, but like with most of his work, most of it is just meandering drivel with a lot of Bible references. Nearly all of it is very rambling enough to ignore. But there was one part in there that definitely needs to be highlighted, and it comes at the very end of the chapter. Don't blame capitalism, the radical left, or the iniquity of your enemies. Don't reorganize the state until you have ordered your own experience. Have some humility. If you cannot bring peace to your household, how dare you try to rule a city? Okay, lots to be said about this passage alone. First off, don't blame capitalism? Okay, sure, that's bog standard advice from someone like him. But don't blame the iniquity of your enemies, especially the radical left? And this is being said by Jordan fucking Peterson? Did he have a stroke or something while he was typing that? Because that's the only way that something like that would make any sense. Or it could just be one of Peterson's typical attempts to come off as the rational centrist, criticizing both sides. Regardless, while that's definitely a blood vessel bursting piece of advice from him, the stuff I'm far more interested in is pretty much everything said after. The don't reorganize the state until you have ordered your own experience. Have some humility. If you cannot bring peace to your household, how dare you try to rule a city part. And here we start getting much closer to what Peterson's really trying to say. This is what he was coming down to since the beginning of this chapter. You see, my reading of this makes it seem that what Jordan actually wants, or rather doesn't want, is for a bunch of snot-faced leftists to go out into the world and try to improve society when they should be simply focused on fixing themselves. Some of you may think that once again I'm taking things too far, and that Peterson isn't actually arguing that, but he's simply giving fairly uncontroversial life advice. After all, what's wrong with having humility? Surely that's a good thing, isn't it? And he's right. If you're having so much trouble keeping the peace within your own home, then how can you do anything like running an entire city? Let us ignore for a moment the specific words Peterson uses, which is quote-unquote, rule a city. Kind of makes it seem like he's giving these people far more power than what they're asking. But okay, you know what? Even with this, I guess if I squint real hard, I can kind of see how reasonable people may walk away thinking this is far more innocuous than how I perceive it. And in fact, when asked about this specific rule, Peterson insists he's not at all doing what I'm claiming he's doing.
I'm not talking from a pinnacle downwards to my audience. I'm stating a fairly blunt fact, which is that we have plenty of tragedy and malevolence to contend with in the confines of our life, and we need to figure out how to deal with that properly without becoming bitter and cruel and resentful. And these rules are guidelines to help people avoid those pitfalls rather than finger-wagging moral injunctions designed to make them feel guilty.
Well, there you have it. It appears I've been unfair to the man, and these are just supposed to be mere harmless guidelines and not at all finger-wagging morality. Except that's a complete load of horseshit. Because as we'll soon find out, and Peterson makes very clear, there is in fact a lot of finger-wagging morality involved in this rule. If all of you were skeptical with all the examples I've used up until now, I would hope that these next set of examples would do away with any further doubts as to what Peterson's game actually is.
How do you think progress should be made in a world where we are freer than we have ever been? Do you think when Are there changes that are desirable to be made, and how would you want to see them implemented, if not through policy or through activism, the way that certain groups currently are promoting?
Well,
them?
back, this happened in the 60s, as far as I can tell, that we got this misbegotten idea that the way to conduct yourself as a responsible human being was to hold placards up, to protest, to change the viewpoints of other people, and thereby usher in the utopia. It's like, I think that's all appalling. I think it's appalling, and I think it's absolutely absurd that students are taught that that's the way to conduct themselves in the world. First of all, if you're 19 or 20 or 21, you don't bloody well know anything. You haven't done anything. You don't know anything about history. You haven't read anything. You haven't supported yourself for any length of time. You've been entirely dependent on your state and on your family for the brief few years of your existence, and the idea that you have enough wisdom to determine how society should be reconstructed when you're sitting in the absolute lap of luxury, protected by processes that you don't understand, is absolutely, I mean, it's... Okay, so that's let's call that a bad idea,
Sure.
Shall we? And then the idea that what you should do to change the world is to find people who you disagree with and shake paper on sticks at them and call them names is also...
But you're not saying don't care about those things or don't act on them, but just while you're doing them, attend to your own limitations and competencies.
Well, I'm saying you should be aware of your own competence and your limits.
Right.
And that's especially true if you're very young, because like, what the hell do you know? You haven't done anything.
Right.
You're like, I tell 18-year-olds, 6 years ago you were 12. It's like, what the hell do you know?
Right.
You haven't, you're under the care of your family or the state. You haven't established an independent existence.
right.
You haven't had children. You haven't started a business. You haven't taken responsibility for anything. You don't have a degree. You haven't finished your courses. You don't know how to read. You can't think. You can't speak. You're ill-kempt. You don't know how to present yourself. Well, Jesus, and it's just not right to tell people in that situation that they should go out and change the socioeconomic structure of the culture.
Okay, as usual, lots to chew on with the Jorpster. But here we finally get to the actual punchline. Here Peterson lays bare exactly the entire point of this particular rule. And that is that he just straight up hates the fact that people on the left, particularly young left-wing college kids, are going out into the world to become activists. This piece of advice is specifically targeted towards that group of people, though not exclusively, and could apply to basically any type of left-wing activist of any age. This is designed so that people like that are preoccupied with doing housework instead of going out into the world and doing things he doesn't like. His advice has pretty much nothing to do with them, but rather everything to do with him. But let's dig in a little bit deeper, shall we? For starters, let's just get this out of the way. What on earth is he babbling about in regards to the whole 6 years ago you were 12 thing? This is yet another recurring example of Peterson saying something that he no doubt thinks sounds incredibly profound, but is actually very idiotic. It's crystal clear that Peterson thinks young people shouldn't involve themselves in political activism because they're lacking in both knowledge and experience. But let's dig a little bit further. For starters, why did he choose 6 years? There seems to be no particular rhyme or reason why he chose that specific number. But it's one that's big enough that when subtracted, can make the targets look significantly more immature than they actually are. But if he's just going to pick numbers at random, why not go bigger than that? Hell, you're only 18. 10 years ago, you were 8. Or 12 years ago, you were 6. Or 17 years ago, you were but a mere 1-year-old infant, barely capable of walking, let alone conquering a country. Second, does he have any idea how long a period 6 years actually is? Going from 6th grade to 12th grade, that's 2 whole levels of schooling. For us here in the great state of California, that's the length of time from just finishing up learning about long division to completing AP Calculus. How many adults do you think remember AP Calculus, if they've even taken it? It's literally the difference between being a pubescent child and legally an adult. 6 years is the length that one could start off college and complete a master's degree. That used to be a common period between video game console upgrades. In 6 years, 5,000 PlayStation 2 games were developed. I think you get my point. Do you seriously think that you're not significantly smarter, significantly wiser at 18 than you were at 12? Or really comparing yourself to any point in your life and 6 years prior? So yes, Jordan, it is true that these 18-year-olds were 12-year-olds 6 years ago, and they've grown up a lot since that time. That's how time works. Imagine what he would say to Martin Luther King Jr. when he was starting out being a civil rights leader. What? How could you let a mere 25-year-old be in charge of such an important movement? I mean, a mere 6 years ago, he was 19, barely out of high school. And then 6 more years before that, he was 13, barely getting accustomed to junior high. Do we want what is essentially a bloody, overgrown middle schooler to try and shape the course of history? Such a thing would be absolute madness. Madness, I say. It's also incredibly dumb because there is no shortage of examples that history is littered with of highly influential people who are also quite young when they were doing great and influential things. During the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Alexander Hamilton was 21, Aaron Burr was 20, and James Monroe was 18. This is just yet another one of Peterson's idiotic attempts to downplay the involvement of people he deems unworthy. Again, I can't get over how utterly stupid this line is the more you think about it. Like, yes, Jordan, if you take an 18-year-old and then remove 1/3 of their entire life experience, then yes, I would imagine that would have quite an impact. When you were younger and less experienced, you tended to be, well, younger and less experienced. Insightful as always. It's completely tautological. Why, yes, you may seem to think you're smarter now than you were 6 years ago. But what about 6 years ago? Weren't so smart back then compared to now, were you? Checkmate, atheists. Now let's tackle the other part of that screed that was just as baffling and moronic. And that was the part where he specifically referenced activists from the 1960s, who were the ones that helped shape future activists. Let me emphasize, activists from the 1960s. If some of you watching this video aren't fully brushed up on your history, there was some pretty serious stuff going on in the United States in the 60s. 2 of those serious things were the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. Those kids with placards and signs with sticks, as he so casually dismissed them, were people who were protesting what they thought was an unjust war and Jim Crow laws. And I'm almost positive that even Peterson knows that, which is what makes it all the more baffling that he chose that period of history as his ground zero for the scourge of political action. Does he seriously think that those things weren't worth immediate and urgent protesting? Now, if he was asked about it, he would more than likely not remotely try to defend it, I'd imagine. In the past, he's repeatedly praised Donald Trump for not getting the U.S. embroiled in foreign wars that have been going on for decades. And as pointed out in my previous video regarding his interview with Jim Jeffries, he's definitely not stupid enough to claim the civil rights movement was a mistake. So what the hell is he complaining about? If asked about it, he'd probably point to some obscure protests involving some students at a tiny liberal arts college no one's ever heard of, trying to save some kind of rare endangered species of fish or turtle in a small town or lake or something, I'd imagine. I mentioned Martin Luther King earlier as someone who Peterson would heavily criticize and dissuade from engaging in any kind of political activism had he been around at the time, considering how MLK had his own share of personal problems. But in the interest of fairness, Peterson was asked about MLK specifically at one point, and he had this to say.
So Martin Luther King, can I use him?
Yeah.
Right? So Martin Luther King had an affair. It was quite well known. His personal life was a bit complex.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't say that, he had to sort that out before he went to sort of try and deal with civil rights in the US. So I'm trying to get at the core of the tension.
No, I would say that his own personal faults didn't preclude his social responsibility. Right. And it really is important to get that straight. But I would say that his own personal faults served as a detriment to his overall mission. Right. And then I'm not, believe me, I'm not saying that if I was in Martin Luther King's position, I would have done a better job. It's like, I am not saying that, man, not in the least.
So here, Peterson was far more diplomatic with his criticism against MLK than how I portrayed him. But of course he would be. How stupid would you have to be to argue that maybe the most famous civil rights hero in American history should have stayed home and mopped the floor until at least a decade later? Even David Duke wouldn't be stupid enough to argue something like that in public. Now, Given everything that I've seen of Peterson thus far, I have absolutely no reason to think that he would act any differently back then to MLK than he would to the most respectable Black Lives Matter activists today. But we'll ignore that and argue against Peterson's points with what he's given us. So he says that he would not at all try to stop MLK from changing the world. He does think that had he had his life in perfect order, it would have helped his cause even further. Again, on the surface, this seems like probably uncontroversial advice, but there's still unfortunately a lot wrong with it. For example, MLK, despite the reputation that we give him nowadays, was not a popular figure at the time. The FBI sent letters telling him to unalive himself. This comic mocking him for causing riots was from a moderate liberal cartoonist and publication. In the last poll conducted while MLK was alive, Gallup reported that only a mere 33% of the US population had a positive view of MLK. The point that I'm getting at is that lots of people already hated him, and him taking care of his issues would say his infidelity would hardly have made a difference. If they didn't have something tangible and real to go after MLK with, they were more than likely just going to make something up. And we know this for a fact already. Say what you will about Barack Obama's policies, and even those on the left have a lot to say about them, but he had a picture-perfect family. Happily married with 2 kids, they'd be right at home in a Norman Rockwell painting. And yet, as we all know, that didn't stop his enemies one bit from making up all kinds of insane things about him and his family. MLK was instrumental in helping pass sweeping civil rights legislation, like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. Had he done what Peterson suggests, it's reasonable to think that many of those major laws probably wouldn't have been a reality until many years later, if at all. If pressed on it further, I imagine Peterson would at the very least not take that extra step and demand that MLK sort things out at home at first, mainly due to him being an exceptional individual. But aside from even that hypothetical excuse being a pathetic cop-out, that also wouldn't really make much sense either. After all, MLK was not a divine being. He didn't start off as a leader of the civil rights movement. He became one after years and years of being part of the movement. At what point did he prove to be this quote-unquote exceptional person that Peterson would graciously allow to be an exception to his stupid rule? I mean, MLK started his doctoral studies in systematic theology at Boston University when he was only 22 years old. And at 25 when he became the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. This was also the age where King took up a leadership role during the Montgomery bus boycotts. Again, I know Peterson wouldn't be stupid enough to say that King shouldn't have involved himself in such matters at such a young age, but had this been anybody else, particularly anybody else that wasn't seen as a historical hero, how do you think Peterson would have reacted? But even granting Peterson's own bullshit exemption, there are still problems with this. Because my next question would be, what about the massive throngs of people that followed MLK, Jordan? Were they allowed to follow him and participate in protests and sit-ins and other acts of civil disobedience? Or should they have waited until their houses were in perfect order too? Because many of those people that followed MLK had very good reasons to do so, specifically for their own well-being. In fact, the civil rights era provides a great example of what Peterson either at best tries to minimize as much as possible, or at worst, completely ignores. That part of the reason that your house might not be in order in the first place is because of problems that are larger and outside the scope of your house. In the case of the civil rights movement, black people by and large were victims of Jim Crow laws. The great Slavoj Žižek pointed out this very thing during a debate with Peterson from a few years ago.
What I only don't quite get, why do you put so much access to this? We have to begin with a personal change. I mean, this is also the second or which one, I don't remember, forgive me, of your slogans in your book. You know, first set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up, which doesn't mean, okay, let's forget about my house. But you can do both at the same time, and I would even say, I will give you now the ultimate example, yourself. Isn't it that you are so socially active? Because you realize that it's not enough to tell to your patients, set your house in order. Much of the reason of why they are in disorder, their house, is that there is some crisis in our society and so on and so on. So my reproach to you, benevolent, would have been, you know, that joke, tea or coffee, yes please. Like individual or social, yes please, because this is obvious in extreme situation. Like I hope we agree to say to somebody in North Korea, set your house in order. No, haha.
And here Zizek makes many great points. Sometimes the systems you live in can have a great effect on your personal life. As he pointed out, it would be completely idiotic for someone suffering in North Korea, for example, to be told by a chowderhead like Peterson to just clean their rooms when their problems are much bigger than that, as they were in the Jim Crow South. And really, how many large-scale problems can be solved by room temperature IQ solutions like Peterson's? We got rid of slavery and Jim Crow because millions of people mobilized against them. The suffragettes were able to band together and influence enough lawmakers to pass the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote. Countless unions, organizations, and advocacy groups allowed for the establishment of labor laws like the minimum wage, 40-hour work weeks, and weekends that we all enjoy to this day. We were able to see to it that the ozone hole is slowly but surely on track to completely heal itself because of spreading awareness, and dozens of countries throughout the entire world made the effort to enact legislation to stop the spread of chemicals that were destroying it in the first place. The United States Rust Belt is a region that has been quite well known to have suffered from the effects of outsourcing and deindustrialization. Many of these cities were previously thriving areas that brought in a lot of economic opportunity. But once several of those factories moved away, in many cases for good, it led to economic hardship for many of the people within those cities. A father who was able to feed his family and pay his mortgage at one point can no longer do so through no fault of his own. No matter how much he tries to tidy up his room or mop the floors or whatever, he's not going to solve what is a very serious materialistic problem. For years, the noble coal miner was shown as a sympathetic figure who was one of the many victims of a changing world. Many coal miners lost their jobs because of things like competition with other forms of energy, such as natural gas, as well as renewables like solar and wind. The coal miner that lost his job, with little other job prospects in the small town that he lives in, will more than likely have a whole host of home-related problems, stemming entirely from the loss of said coal job. Cleaning his room, no matter how hard he tries, is probably not going to make much of a difference at all. And whether somebody might disagree with the idea of coal-powered energy on an ideological level, everyone can understand that this person would do whatever he can to try and get that coal job back. This is one of the reasons why Donald Trump was incredibly popular with these people, because he promised to bring their jobs back. While he didn't do a particularly great job of fulfilling that promise, the point is, it's highly doubtful that somebody like Peterson would tell such a coal miner to not vote for Trump or to not join in some kind of advocacy group holding up the same kind of placards and signs that were held by left-wing advocates that he just disdainfully pointed out. The average miner in a coal town that lost his job because the plant shut down didn't just decide to stay home and vacuum his carpet as long as possible. No, he voted for a guy who said he would come and make his life better by bringing his job back. Many people like this hypothetical person did things like voting for Trump exactly because he said he could help them. Were they wrong to do so? Practically every large-scale issue I can think of required a large-scale solution. Hell, even Peterson's pathetic crusade against Bill C-16, the very thing that led him to become a worldwide right-wing superstar, also required collective action. He wasn't trying to keep his opposition for the bill secret. He wanted to let as many people know about it as humanly possible, and to get as many people on his side as humanly possible to enact change. Also, he loves to give dating advice to young men, and sure, while he does tell them to improve themselves to make them more attractive and appealing for women occasionally, do you think he just stops there? Of course not. He's blamed tons of society's problems on large-scale systemic things like feminism. Do you think he doesn't want to change the culture of feminism that he thinks has changed the course of Western civilization for the worse? Do you think he's just throwing his hands up in the air and going, well, we can't do anything about those radical feminists anymore, so better not to offer any opinion on how to change anything on their end, and so we all just need to work in this permanent, unchanging world that they've created? Of course he wouldn't. Remember, this is a guy who complained about the movie Frozen being feminist propaganda. The more I think about it, the more I'm genuinely curious what even would be an example of society-wide change that only succeeded on an individual level, because I'm genuinely drawing a blank. Also, one other important thing that Zizek mentioned.
How do we usually deal with ecology? By this false personalization, you know. They tell you, what did you do? Did you put all the Coke cans on the side? Did you recycle all paper and so? Yes, we should do this. But, you know, like, in a way, this is also a very easy way to discharge yourself. Like, you say, okay, I do the recycling, so up, you know. I did my duty, let's go on. So I would just say, why the choice there?
I'm sure that Peterson would prefer something like that over widespread systemic change, especially the kind that would inconvenience his precious oil companies. Zizek is absolutely right that to Peterson, the recycler in question would just come across as virtue signaling that he's better than everyone else and dreams of being a would-be tyrant, and thus earn almost as much contempt from Peterson. So this hypothetical person, if he follows Peterson's advice, would greatly limit his effect on the world, while also more than likely still being sneered at by Peterson himself. Or, as Peterson would call it, a win-win. And what does he consider changing the world anyway? We already know that he really hates the idea of protesting, but what if it's something as simple, and even encouraged, as voting? Voting is generally a hell of a lot easier than going out and protesting, and in most cases, can wind up even being more effective than protesting. Not to mention, there are many people who would think that voting is a part of your civic duty. Would Jordan be okay with doing something like that when their house isn't in perfect order? This is a genuine question, by the way. When described in such a manner, no doubt some of you are probably still thinking that there's no way Peterson can believe any of this because it sounds laughably idiotic. Surely nobody would be dumb enough to genuinely argue that people should completely recuse themselves from participating in all forms of activism in society until some vague long-term length of time when they no longer have any problems, right? If at this point you're still doubtful, and if none of the prior clips were blatant enough to reveal Peterson's true intentions, well, good news. I got a few more. But before we get to that, I would just like to quickly mention that a very annoying aspect of Peterson's behavior, which has been present since he became famous, is his incredibly frustrating and rage-inducing habit of saying something that sounds incredibly stupid and then immediately retreating from it when called out by others. And it's equally frustrating when you never know what stupid thing that he says happens to be something he actually decides to stick by, or will try to back down from at a later point. But to his credit, in this particular case of young people not getting involved in activism, or at the very least, climate activism, is something that he has shown some level of consistency on, as he demonstrates in the following video clip.
So what is your advice to young people when you talk about you need to be individually responsible, but when there are things that are so far out of our control, like climate catastrophe, like the precarious job economy, like the economic
far
crisis?
Out of your control as you think.
What is your answer to
Do you think
people
that
who
you're
are
worse
facing
off
these
than
questions?
you think that you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think there are different challenges.
Do you think you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think that
Jordan, once again, we're not going to cross-examine our questioners. So try answering the question about collective responsibility on climate change, for example. Pick one part of that, because the argument, I think, is that individual responsibility does not change the climate, does not fix the problem that needs global collective responsibility. So I think that's the core of the question. Do you have a theory about that?
Well, fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, and then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions. I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world, which happens in many ways.
So, can I just to... If a young person believes that the climate, the global warming problem on the climate is something that needs to be tackled quickly, and they can't wait until they grow up and become prime ministers to do it, do you think collective responsibility overrides individual responsibility in a huge issue like that?
No.
No.
Okay. I don't. Okay. I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors. That's what it looks like.
Okay, Catherine.
I will say it's quite refreshing to see the incredibly rare phenomenon of Jordan Peterson saying what he means with his whole chest for once. Props to the young lady and host in this video, for they've managed to achieve one of the titanic and legendary feats of the modern age, making Jordan Peterson actually answer a yes or no question with a yes or no answer. This is an accomplishment that has been achieved probably no more than 3 times in the professor's life. Of course, in typical Jordan Peterson fashion, being the slippery little weasel that he is, he also tries to massage his shitty opinion to make it seem slightly more palatable. He knows that outright telling people to not engage in activism is a pretty stupid expectation. So as usual, he tries to cover his ass by insisting that he's not arguing for the very thing that he's arguing in favor of. As in many of his debates and discussions, he tries to get away on asinine technicalities. So in this particular case, Peterson can argue that he never said that he's trying to stop young leftist activists from engaging in activism. Only that he wants them to achieve a certain level of competence, a level decided entirely by him, by the way, before they do so. But therein lies the problem. For these young people to achieve Peterson's acceptable level of competence is not supposed to be an easy undertaking. After all, do you seriously think Peterson wants these kids to just read a couple of books on climatology for a few weeks and then they're good to go? Or is it more likely that given everything Peterson has said so far, he thinks that setting your house in order is by definition supposed to be a very difficult task, one that takes a lot of time and diligence to complete? Obviously it's the latter, because the former doesn't make any sense in Peterson's world. To use Peterson's own words, how on earth can somebody dare rule a city in just a couple of weeks? This is the kind of thing that would be a multi-year process, probably at least a decade, in fact, and the longer the better. Basically, Peterson is telling people like this young lady that he's not at all trying to stop her from changing the world. He just simply wants her to complete a reasonable task, like climbing Mount Everest or clean the Augean stables first. That's all. Easy peasy. And what would competency in regards to climate change even look like? Because despite what many of his idiot fans such as Adam and Sitch think, Peterson doesn't think man-made climate change is even a thing, and even if it was, it's not a big deal to begin with. So how do you become competent to a sufficient degree in Peterson's mind in a subject that he's fundamentally at odds with? The point being that this time spent away from climate activism will hopefully eventually cause them to grow out of their climate activism. That's his true goal. For Peterson, the best kind of climate activist is the kind that doesn't believe in climate activism. So despite Peterson attempting to have his cake and eat it too, as far as I'm concerned, he leaves no room whatsoever for any further doubt. He doesn't care if climate change is an immediate threat, one that we can't wait some indiscriminate amount of time before we deal with it. Too bad. You're an 18-year-old, you don't know anything about climatology. More importantly, according to Peterson, even they don't care about it. They're just latching onto a specific cause because it'll get them Twitter likes or some shit. So no, you shouldn't be doing this. But if you're doing this, you should at the very least set this one out until your house is spotless, literally and metaphorically. And if you still need more proof on what Jorp's true feelings and intentions are.
But to disparage those who are actually caring about the issue, are you saying that, look, they're basically showboating? They're just kind of showing off, it's kind of empty rhetoric. Okay.
Yeah, they're definitely. It's worse than that.
Right.
It's compassion masking uselessness most of the time.
So, but you're also saying, you know, these people who complain about the world, they should just focus on their own what they can control themselves and work within that space.
To begin with.
But equally, there is a slight derision in the tone about people who actually care about bigger than self issues.
It's not slight.
Okay, it's big then. So, bigger than self problems, which arguably...
They don't care about them. They just act like they're just acting out the delusion that they care about them, generally.
You see?
The nice thing about people like Peterson is that you give them enough time to speak, and they'll just quit putting up any pretense whatsoever. Granted, sometimes it takes forever for this to happen, but it eventually does. So again, he feels like these climate change activists don't even believe in the things they're protesting. He thinks they're just doing it for fun or socializing or Twitter clout or God knows what else. So again, he just fundamentally thinks these people shouldn't be doing this. Oh, and if that's not enough, here's another nugget of galaxy brain wisdom.
You know, people say, well, I'm taking climate change seriously. I'm going out to protest. Like, you're not taking it seriously. That's not serious. Serious is you're going to devote 80 hours of your life to it for the rest of your life, right? You're going to work on that so intently that you're not even going to think about anything else. Like, that's serious.
So unless you dedicate 80 hours a week, as in 2 full-time jobs, and I'm assuming he means for the rest of your life, on an issue like climate change, then you can't go out to protest because doing so otherwise just demonstrates that you're not serious about it? Hell, Peterson himself, who was pathologically obsessed with Bill C-16, didn't manage to dedicate 80 hours a week to take it down. Does this mean that he wasn't serious about defeating the bill? Again, this is the top genius intellectual on the right nowadays. To reiterate, Peterson doesn't just think that it's not the best course of action to try and engage in this kind of activism, but it is in fact destructive and detrimental to not heed his teachings. Maybe the great Jordan Peterson would be inclined to give these ungrateful brats the permission to vote once every 4 years for a presidential election perhaps. On the other hand, as mentioned before, voting, especially for somebody in high office, might actually have more of an impact than by other forms of activism, so maybe that's being a little too generous. Perhaps they could start out voting in their local election for dog catcher or something, a position that would cause far less damage, presumably. Also, what makes Peterson's complaints about these youngsters ruling cities all the more incoherent is that he makes it sound like these young people are becoming legislators, mayors, governors, and even presidents the moment their 18th birthday hits, as if they're the ones actually crafting legislation. Most government offices have fairly high age requirements to begin with, so these young activists would have to wait several years before they could get elected in the first place. In the United States, for example, you have to be at least 25 years old to be a member of the House of Representatives, 30 to be a member of the Senate, and 35 to become president. And as far as states and local governments go, well, those will vary state by state and city by city, but it's a safe bet that few of those positions are available for kids immediately out of high school. Regardless, it's also an irrelevant point. While it helps being in government, it's not a requirement to enact change. Similar to how not every single person who participated in the civil rights movement was Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, these young people don't need to be a Barack Obama or Bernie Sanders or AOC, and can go out and vote for older and more experienced people to enact policies they support. People who are much more knowledgeable on climate change, taxes, foreign policy, or what have you. That includes not just elected officials well into adulthood, but also scientists, statisticians, and all kinds of other experts as well. From every single level, Peterson's argument is completely incoherent and falls apart immediately. As you can see in the clip above, he just goes ahead and outright admits he just doesn't want young people to participate in changing the world at such a young age. He thinks they need to grow up, become more educated, and then maybe a decade or two after that, then maybe they can start doing things like going out to protest and running for some kind of government office. I don't disagree that there's anything wrong with cleaning your room. I can totally accept that can be mostly a good thing. Aside from the obvious hygienic benefits, a clean room means an organized room, thus allowing you to have a much better way of getting your priorities in order. So I got absolutely no problem with that. But as Zizek correctly pointed out, this doesn't have to be an either-or situation. How about one tries to set their house in order, but also tries to do what they can to make the world a better place? To go back to an earlier clip, Peterson mentioned that these people aren't allowed to do anything because they haven't even started paying taxes yet. Again, another very dumb take in my opinion. But the Peterson fans that I've spoken to argue that there's nothing controversial about this, because if there's an upcoming election to say raise taxes on the rich, would you trust somebody who has spent years running a business, or defer to some 18-year-old that's never actually worked and thus hasn't even paid taxes yet? So it's common sense, actually. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this particular argument. After all, men don't experience childbirth, but they still get to vote on things like abortion. People who don't have kids are still allowed to vote on policies that involve kids, and so forth. But even if I grant you that some cases might need lots of time and research to reach an educated conclusion, what about issues that aren't nearly as complex? To use the example in the video clip complaining about college kids in the 60s, I'm curious, does Peterson think that these kids were not knowledgeable or experienced enough to decide whether or not they wanted to be, sent off to be killed in a war they didn't support? Were they too dumb to understand whether allowing black people and white people to sit next to each other in restaurants was a good or bad thing? For something more current, what about something that specifically affects college students, like voting for somebody who will help them with their student loan payments? I would also argue that Jordan Peterson's criteria for setting your house in order is pretty stupid as well. Getting married doesn't make you an expert on, say, the child tax credit. Getting a house doesn't make you much smarter when it comes to crafting policies on property taxes. Now, yes, you can research these tax policies and you can vote for policies that can benefit you, of course. But that's not the same thing as working on policies that help the world. In fact, it could do the exact opposite in many cases. Something that benefits you does not necessarily mean it's beneficial for others. In fact, the property tax example is a perfect case of exactly that. In California, we had this fun little law that was passed in the late 1970s called Prop 13. This froze property taxes at a certain level, which was great for people who are already committed homeowners and such. But freezing these tax rates caused revenues to plummet. Revenues that were going to go to things like schools and local roads and what have you. Those things ended up being severely underfunded, and as a result, lots of schools and roads ended up in poor conditions. So I'm not exactly clear what Peterson even thinks should happen to the people who follow his advice. Like, is the idea to first improve your own lives and get your houses in order so that you could then reasonably enact policies that change other people's lives as well for the better? Or is it more likely to continue to improve your own life and vote for things that wind up repeatedly benefiting you specifically? Because those two things are not necessarily compatible. The entire foundation for Peterson's fears seem to be built on multiple straw men. First of all, he seems to think that there may be thousands, perhaps even millions of Gen Z activists that want to completely obliterate capitalism. There's a very high chance that this seems to be based entirely upon Peterson encountering random anonymous Twitter users with names like I Love Stalin 1984, who call him things like Kermit. I think Peterson can rest easy knowing that capitalism might be safe for the near future. It almost feels insulting to actually have to try to address this particularly dumb complaint, but I suppose I should for those who are out there that are still unfortunately dumb enough to not understand why this is insane. Most of the left-wing activists, both in real life and Twitter, that I happen to know, are trying to do their best just to get things like a couple of percentage point increase on taxes on the wealthy, and trying to make it so that people who are forced to get ambulance rides for medical emergencies aren't charged something like $5,000 for it. The most radical left-wing individuals in Congress are probably Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, neither of which has ever, to my knowledge, advocated for the complete elimination of capitalism. I do find it funny that one of the biggest memes associated with Peterson is a positive one in his favor, mocking the interview that he did with Kathy Newman for having her strawman him, when Peterson himself is the king of strawmen. Kathy Newman may have done so a couple of times throughout one interview. Peterson, on the other hand, has done so constantly throughout multiple years. Hell, probably his entire life. Nobody is saying that 18-year-olds have all the answers. But they're old enough to have morals and opinions, some of which, like, say, gay people should have the right to get married, or not wanting a chemical manufacturing corporation to dump arsenic in their lakes without having to take potential decades for them to properly educate themselves. To use a personal example, just a few years ago there was a major gas leak nearby, just a few miles away from where I lived, and this gas leak was spewing tons of toxic chemicals into the air at an alarming rate, and it took months to take care of. Should people in my city and the surrounding cities affected by this massive gas leak have waited multiple years before we were actually able to do anything about it? One of Jordan's biggest heroes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, became a very influential writer and activist against the Soviet Union. No doubt that he had immense baggage to deal with from his horrific ordeal in the gulags. And yet he still went ahead and tried to do his part in changing the world by letting them know about the horrors of the Soviet Union. And if he didn't do that, then people like Jordan Peterson would have never known about it. There's no way that Jordan would think that he shouldn't have done what he did until he fully got his life in perfect order. Again, whatever that means. Especially considering that what Solzhenitsyn went through, it would no doubt take an extremely long time for him to get his life in perfect order. Certainly more so than the average college student that Peterson would no doubt hold to an infinitely higher standard. But what's also great about this is that even Peterson himself doesn't believe in the bullshit that he's spewing. In the clips that you've seen, sure, he has a lot of bile that he spews at what he thinks are radical left-wing ideologues, as he says. But can anyone imagine him saying remotely the same things with anywhere near the same level of contempt to, say, a group of young conservative activists? The man went on tour with Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk. TPUSA is a right-wing organization led by a young right-wing activist that seeks to turn young people into conservative activists. Does anyone think that Peterson joined this activist organization so that he could tell all the members involved in said activist organization to stop being activists for at least a decade or so until they get their houses in order? Not a chance in hell. Imagine Peterson yelling at a group of young conservatives that want to lower their taxes, or young NRA members fighting for gun rights. And can anyone seriously picture Peterson shrieking at pro-life protesters in front of a Planned Parenthood telling them to knock it off and go home and focus on cooking for their partners, and if they have them, take care of their kids? Do you think he would tell them not to engage in political activism until they've perfected their lives? Again, no way, no how. I mean, this isn't even a fantastic hypothetical. We know for a fact that he wouldn't do this, because, not to belabor the point, he himself has been an active member of this organization and hasn't done so once. Furthermore, I can tell you one other thing. The Jorpster had zero problem with young people joining him in his crusade against Bill C-16. I've seen quite a few videos of the man over the years, and I can tell you with 1,000,000% confidence that there is not a single video that exists, a single solitary instance, ever, where Peterson would lambast the college kids following him on his mission for quote-unquote free speech, reminding them that they're only 18 or 19, and what the hell do they know about anything in life, let alone engaging in something as important and valuable as legislation involving free speech. In fact, Jorp actually encouraged his own patients from his clinical practice to join him in his pursuit for fighting for quote-unquote free speech. It's true. While Peterson was on his little crusade, his patients would email him to schedule appointments and ask questions and such, only to get an automatic response, informing them of the situation and encouraging them to write letters to the Canadian government in support of Peterson and his opposition to Bill C-16. Now, it might just be me, but I would think that somebody who's currently in the process of seeking out a therapist would not be somebody who has their house in perfect order, hence the therapy sessions, right? And yet Peterson had absolutely no problem enlisting people like this, presumably people who don't have very clean rooms, by the mere fact that they're seeking help from someone like Peterson in the first place, and are probably a good deal of ways from having their house in any order, let alone perfect. But for mysterious and unexplainable reasons, these people were allowed to put their personal problems on hold in order to tackle more noble and large-scale pursuits. Perhaps by simply being in the presence of the genius psychologist Jordan B. Peterson for even a short period of time, Peterson deemed their rooms were clean enough to, at the very least, help him in his divine mission to protect free speech. Yeah, so I was looking over your file, and in my professional medical opinion, I can safely declare that your room is clean enough, and thus you're perfectly mentally fit to aid me in my noble quest to own the libs. Not to mention he gave his full and unconditional backing for those Canadian trucker protests during the pandemic. Did every single one of those thousands and thousands of people involved in those protests happen to have perfectly clean rooms? Peterson seems to think so, as he has never thus far uttered even a single word admonishing those people for wasting their lives out in the cold when they could be doing so much more productive things at home. Though I'm sure all these were just minor oversights on his part. But what's even more interesting is that on occasion, even Peterson himself doesn't think the people he's criticizing should follow his stupid rule either. Just to quickly review, one of Peterson's rationales for this whole clean your room business is that you start with tasks that are small and localized as possible. And from there, you can branch out and accomplish bigger goals as time goes by and your competence increases. So theoretically, one would start off by, say, getting into local politics first, then state, then federal, and perhaps even international. Got that? Now check out this next clip.
I've seen a video of you saying that feminists, not radical feminists, but feminists have an unconscious wish for brutal male domination.
The feminists, it's got to be because Muslims right now are higher up on the victim hierarchy than them. So even if it's way over there, they're not allowed to speak out against it.
I think it's their unconscious wish for brutal male domination.
I don't think so.
Man,
I like that. That's fun.
It doesn't quite square with what you've just told me.
Well, one of the things that I'm very curious about is the relative lack of, the relative silence on the part of Western feminists about countries that truly are oppressive, like Saudi Arabia.
It's not exactly answering the question, though.
Oh, it's exactly answering the question, because I'm looking for the psychological reason why there would be much less reaction on the part of the radical feminists to countries that generally are oppressive of patriarchies, instead of reacting the way they are to Western countries which genuinely aren't.
You mentioned something about Islam on Twitter. You said that do feminists not attack Islam because they're secretly desiring of,
well, there's a real question there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, do you see the feminists criticizing Saudi Arabia?
Yes.
Well, not very much.
Yeah.
That's for sure. So, like, what's going on there?
I feel like as though they do. I don't know.
Well, I don't feel, okay, well, some of them do some of the time, but they seem to, what would you say, reserve most of their vitriol for the oppressive patriarchal structures of the West. There aren't societies in the world where women have more status than the West.
Should they be happy with what they have?
I don't know if people should or could ever be happy with what they have, but a little bit of gratitude might be in order. A little bit of understanding of the situation in a historical context might be in order.
So feminists living in the US and other Western nations, instead of focusing on improving their own cities and countries, i.e. their own rooms and houses, they should instead focus their efforts on helping out women outside their countries and in places thousands of miles away, such as the Middle East instead. Now, somebody can please correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think, metaphorically speaking, if you're a feminist in, say, California, a country like Saudi Arabia would be quite a bit of distance outside your room, so to speak. I would think that changing something outside your own country would be an even more difficult endeavor than changing something within your own country. And furthermore, I would also think that trying to pursue something like fully eliminating the wage gap would be a slightly easier goal than, say, getting women the ability to drive in some of the most extreme patriarchal, misogynist, and authoritarian countries on the planet. But according to Jorp, this is one of those rare and fun instances where it's perfectly fine not to start off small and local, apparently. All that whining about potentially making things much worse because you're not smart enough to tackle large-scale issues apparently doesn't apply for changing the culture of multiple repressive Middle Eastern countries. Of course, it's obvious why somebody like Peterson is saying this. And it's not because the blight of misogyny had finally been defeated in the US and Canada. No, it's far more straightforward than that, as it usually is once you cut away all the flowery bullshit. He wants the feminists to stop causing so much trouble inside Western countries because it personally affects him, his worldview, and his fan base, and he doesn't like it. So in cases like this, the great Jordan Peterson offers ungrateful feminists his royal exemptions to not set your house in order first, and yonder forth and be free to change the world. in this very specific case, as they see fit. The man is as magnanimous as he is principled. So to summarize, Peterson is by no means telling people not to engage in widespread political change, and how dare you assume that he would say such an idiotic thing, but rather, he just wants people to be aware that you're going to need minimum multiple years of experience handling much smaller tasks first before you even contemplate doing such a thing on any larger scale. And even if you have all that, there's still the very high possibility that you may in fact make things even worse. All the while people like Peterson himself will be lambasting you endlessly. So definitely something to keep in mind and hopefully give you much consideration. But also if you decide to not heed the great Jorp's advice and want to change the world, then you shouldn't start small at all, and can start with changing the entire culture of multiple non-Western countries as a much easier alternative, no doubt. See? What could be so hard to understand about all that? Another issue I have with this asinine piece of advice is something that I've especially taken great anger towards as I've gotten more familiar with politics over the years, and that's the idea of being a supposed neutral bystander. In Peterson's mind, taking yourself out of the political process, at least when he feels that you're not mature enough to participate in it, is supposed to be a good thing, because if you're not part of that process, then that means you don't have the ability to cause harm. Except that's not remotely how reality works, at all. Let's pretend that someone happens to be walking along the shore of a lake, and out in the distance you see somebody's boat turned over, and the person who is in the boat can't swim and is about to drown. If you were fully capable of saving that person, but chose not to, and just decided to stand there until they die, was this the correct decision? According to our benevolent lobster king, it absolutely would be. Inaction is inherently a good thing, apparently, because the logic is that inaction doesn't cause harm, or I guess, in his world, causes the least amount of harm. Never mind that the person in the lake might wind up dying. Or how about another case where you happen to see a mugger trying to rob an old woman, and that mugger plans on killing said old woman after he robs her, and you just decide to sit back and allow this to happen, even though there was a possibility that you could have stopped it. Well, here's another case where, despite what Peterson says, inaction doesn't minimize harm and in fact would enable it. To be clear, I'm not necessarily arguing that a person in both these situations absolutely has to risk their lives to save those people. In both cases, it's quite possible that a person could wind up hurting themselves or even worse. My only point is to demonstrate that inaction in no way minimizes harm. When Peterson used to pretend that he wasn't your bog-standard right-winger, he liked to play the role of the enlightened centrist. And that's what this stupid piece of advice actually is. It's the enlightened centrist position. If there is a certain policy, doesn't matter what, if you neither vote for it or against it, but just completely sit it out, then this is the safest bet that causes the least amount of harm. Again, this is extremely stupid advice that's utterly naive at best and incredibly malicious at worst. Refusing to participate in the electoral process doesn't guarantee minimized harm. All it does is guarantee that whichever side has the most votes or resources will win. And finally, we absolutely have to address the 98-pound lobster in the room. And that is the fact that this advice, setting your house in perfect order before you dare criticize the world, is being given by Jordan fucking Peterson, of all people. This is a man who, on Joe Rogan's show, admitted to suffering through all kinds of mental problems, such as depression, since he was at least 13. This is a man who has been having drug problems for a large portion of his life.
And I've had depression since I was 13 probably, and very severe. And I've treated it a variety of ways, some of them quite successfully. But it's been a constant battle, and my father had it, and his father had it, and it's all just rife in my family.
When you say depression, define it.
How would you define it?
Because that's a blanket term.
Yeah. Well, imagine that you wake up and that you remember that all your family was killed in a horrible accident yesterday.
And you would feel that even if nothing was wrong.
Yes.
Just
It's
dread.
actually worse than that. The last thing that went away for me, I was still having a bitch of a time with mood regulation, and that sucked because when I changed my diet, I didn't respond to antidepressants properly anymore. They weren't working. And so although I was getting better physically in a variety of ways, like radical ways, I was really having a bitch of a time regulating my mood, and I was having sporadic, really negative reactions to food when I ate something I shouldn't. So that took about 1.5 years to clear up. And I was still really anxious in the morning up to 3 months ago, like horribly, and then it would get better all day. People said, well, you're under a lot of stress. And I thought, yeah, I've been under a lot of stress for like 10 years. It's like...
This is a man who in recent years got addicted to benzos, leading to withdrawals so severe that he had to go through a medically induced coma in Russia to heal himself. And this guy, this utter clown, has the audacity to tell anyone else to not attempt to change the world until they have their house in perfect order? Before Peterson rose to worldwide fame, he was very much a political activist, going on news programs railing against things like atheism and feminism. He's been doing this sort of thing for a long, long time. And to my recollection, he's never stopped at virtually any point of his own free will to get his house in order. He seems to have absolutely no problem constantly going after other activists, large and small. But does it seem like somebody who is completely in control of their lives and has their house anywhere near perfect order? Because we know for a fact that at the very least, he doesn't keep his office that way. From the famous New York Times interview where Jorp opined over his famous enforced monogamy solution to stop incels from killing women, Mr. Peterson's office has objects scattered and strewn throughout. There is a hat from a gulag, some steampunk masks that he thought were cool, stacks of paper and cords, and a Kermit puppet his sister sent him because his fans joke that his voice, high and hoarse, sounds like the Muppet. Mr. Peterson stresses the importance of cleanliness, but honestly, his office is a mess. Well, knock me over with the feather. Of course, no doubt there are some of you lobsters out there who are more than likely going to chime in by pointing out that actually, Peterson did in fact completely clean his room before he went back to business as usual. At least one time anyway. After all, there was pretty much complete silence for at least a year or so while he was recovering from his benzo-induced coma. Sorry guys, but y'all can shove it. Yes, it's true Peterson did wait until he was fully healed from his ordeal before he started whining on Twitter about people like Elliot Page and Justin Trudeau again. But the only reason he waited that long wasn't because of his supposed principled adherence to his own advice, but rather, and far more simply, because he literally had no choice. Because you see, a large portion of his time away from Twitter was due to him being in a coma. Kind of hard to tweet when you're in that particular state, even for the mighty Jordan Peterson. Furthermore, for those of you unaware, going into a medically induced coma is not the safest thing in the world. One of the reasons for that is because there's a high chance something could go wrong, like getting severe brain damage. There was a long period after Peterson awoke from his coma, where there was still nothing but radio silence. And that's because when he wasn't in a coma, he was still hospitalized in bed, unable to do practically anything. And even after he came out of the hospital, there was still very little footage of him doing anything that showed that he was anywhere near back to normal. For a long time, we were just shown random images and videos of instances of Peterson just standing around, getting his picture taken, and playing with an RC car without saying a word. It led a lot of people to think there must have been some complications that went on as a result of him being in the medically induced coma. Because if everything was fine, you would expect some video of Peterson actually saying something, literally anything, which he didn't do for quite a while. In addition to benzos, another drug Peterson is highly addicted to is Twitter. The fact that he took such a long time to return to that platform is evidence of just how fucked up his condition actually was. Because I can promise you, if Peterson even remotely had the capacity to tweet from his hospital bed, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that he would have done so every single day, as long as he was capable of doing so. And let's not gloss over the whole Twitter addiction thing. That wasn't an exaggeration on my part. The man is literally addicted to Twitter. Let's take a quick fun trip back to the spring of 2022. The magazine Sports Illustrated released their cover models for the newest issue. One of those models was Yumi Nu, who was noteworthy for being a plus-size model, and so had a body type Sports Illustrated hadn't highlighted in their issues up until this point. And while most normal people appreciated the fact that Sports Illustrated was including more diversity in body types, the Lobster King had a different opinion. and thus took to Twitter to express his displeasure by tweeting out, "Sorry, not beautiful, and no amount of authoritarian tolerance is going to change that." Unfortunately for Peterson, most people, including some of his fans even, didn't take too kindly to the Jorpster providing a dose of reality, and an immense backlash ensued. Peterson was no doubt expecting to earn the Presidential Medal of Freedom for speaking truth to power, or whatever the Canadian equivalent of that is, and the negative reactions seemed to have genuinely taken him by surprise. Being overwhelmed with mockery and finding few allies willing to back him up for telling it like it is, Peterson announced that he would be taking a hiatus away from Twitter and its toxic environment. "I recently stopped accessing Twitter for 3 weeks as an experiment. I had some of my staff post video links, etc. It was a genuine relief. I started to read and write more. I started using it again a few days ago, and I would say that my life got worse again almost instantly." You don't say. "So I told my staff to change my password to keep me from temptation, and I'm departing once again. If I have something to say, I'll write an article or make a video. If the issue is not important enough to justify that, then perhaps it would be best to just let it go." Okay, once again, lots to say about the little that was said. First of all, I can't help but chuckle at the idea of Peterson going through his own personal odyssey, drawing parallels to the great hero Odysseus, having his men tie him to his ship so that he would be able to resist the enticing song of the sirens. Second, while I totally appreciate Peterson admitting that he has absolutely no self-control or discipline, that he had to resort to having his staff forcibly keeping him off Twitter, I'm very doubtful that even this happened. Notice how he says that he had his staff make tweets in his absence. Considering there's no way to confirm, this could feasibly give Peterson an out. But okay, fine. Let's give him that. For the sake of argument, let's pretend that he did in fact somehow miraculously manage to stay away from Twitter for a whole 3 weeks. If that happened, then it must have been a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. Because after announcing his second hiatus, he tweeted no less than 17 additional times. Peterson definitely gives off the same righteous anger as a 3-year-old angry at their parents for not giving them cookies for dinner, repeatedly threatening to run away from home.
Bye.
See you later.
See you later.
Be safe.
Bye.
What happened? What happened? What's wrong? What's wrong?
I don't want to go.
Oh, you don't want to go?
But I would be remiss if I didn't mention this wonderful nugget. "The endless flood of vicious insult is really not something that can be experienced anywhere else. I like to follow the people I know, but I think the incentive structure of the platform makes it intrinsically and dangerously insane." This tweet is one of the best encapsulations of Jordan Peterson. I mean, seriously. The endless flood of vicious insults? Buddy, you're the one who started all this. You're the one who insulted that supermodel because she didn't give you a chubby and therefore deprived all red-blooded males of their respective chubbies as well. The complete obliviousness, the utter lack of self-awareness, the pathetic self-victimization after people dared to hit back. And this irony and hypocrisy was thankfully not lost on everyone. But the fun doesn't end there either, because not long after Chubbygate, yes, that's a double entendre, Peterson once again found himself in hot water when he got suspended from Twitter because he decided to repeatedly misgender Elliot Page. While Peterson and his fans thought it was an utter outrage, as well as a complete miscarriage of justice, the Jorpster simultaneously thought this ban was in fact a good thing. Because, as is the case with every spurned lover who insisted afterwards they never wanted to be with the person that they obsessively sought in the first place, Jorp thought Twitter did him a favor.
Twitter's a rat hole in the final analysis, and I have probably contributed to that while trying to use, understand, and master that horrible, toxic platform. No doubt I owe some apologies for that, and I'm trying to learn, but it's a relief in some real sense to be banned.
Sure thing, buddy. No doubt you truly mean it this time. You know what they say, 12th time's a charm. Though I guess I do have to give Peterson an iota of credit. He did in fact stick to his guns, and refused to delete the offending tweets in question, and thus wasn't able to return to Twitter. Seems his addiction to Twitter lost out to his hatred of trans people. Trans ideology. Of course, just a few months later, after one of Peterson's intellectual equals, Elon Musk, bought the platform and reinstated him, the Jorpster wasted no time returning to the very same horrible, toxic rat hole that he was allegedly grateful for no longer being a part of. On the plus side, at least we got this legendary meme out of it.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
So yeah, this is your king, Lobsters? And this is someone you want to take self-help advice from? Someone with willpower this flimsy? This is somebody who you think can improve your life? I've also seen both Peterson and his fans repeatedly reminding everyone that during that time, his wife was going through a serious bout with cancer. As with the benzos-induced coma, I can totally understand how this would be an incredibly harsh ordeal for anybody to go through. But it's exactly because both of those ordeals were so serious that Peterson should have followed his advice even closer. Not to mention this excuse doesn't make much sense either. His wife had cancer, therefore it was completely okay for him to go on tour whining about how postmodern neo-Marxists were destroying the universities, and by extension, Western civilization? Regardless, he never stopped doing what he was doing to focus on his wife and his own personal problems. He was still going around, conducting speaking engagements, doing interviews on political media outlets, and with political figures, and posting like crazy on Twitter, trying his best to change the world, all the while his life was falling apart. So I ask again, what gives him the right to constantly try to change the world by preaching to millions of people without setting his house in perfect order, while simultaneously sneering with contempt, if not outright abject rage, at the average blue-haired college freshman wanting to ban plastic bags or something at her local grocery store? So to be clear once again, Peterson waiting a long time before getting back to his usual shenanigans isn't an example of him diligently sticking to his principles. It's a paraplegic not being able to run a marathon. I have an ounce of sympathy and pity for the trouble that he went through, but there's nothing admirable or commendable with respect to him being forced by reality to follow his own shitty rule. But hey, it's all completely fine, guys. Don't worry. What? You think Jordan Peterson's a hypocrite for trying to change the world while his life was in complete shambles? Well, think again, bucko. Because I was far from the only person who threw out these types of criticisms. When a Twitter user tweeted at Peterson with an amusing picture of him in a very unclean room, Peterson had this to say: "I was ill, and a lot happened at once. It's damn near clean again. Nobody said it was easy." Incredible. Just look at that modesty. Admitting that cleaning one's room is quite difficult even for the legendary Jordan Peterson. But hey, great news that it's almost clean again. Of course, that still didn't stop him from pursuing his crusade to change the world before it got fully clean, but, you know. Also, just a few months later, YouTuber and podcast host Ethan Klein criticized Peterson on the very same thing, to which Peterson had this to say: "Not anymore. It's now shiny clean and beautiful too. Like the rest of my house, now that I've finished renovating and recovering from being ill." See, people? Everything's fine and dandy now. It only took a couple of months, but by golly, his room is completely and utterly 100% perfect, and there is absolutely nothing in Peterson's life that apparently needs any additional work whatsoever. The man has achieved perfection, yet again, and in hardly any time too. And also even more good news. His fans seem to agree that there's hardly an ounce of inconsistency or hypocrisy on Peterson's part whatsoever. He is no longer on benzos and, as listed, is in the process of taking steps to remove stressors from his life. There is no perfect, but we can always strive towards perfection, self-improvement, and becoming a better version of oneself. He is not what he could be, but he's trying. That's the whole philosophy. Don't celebrate inactivity and lack of development. You seem to have missed it. His YouTube channel hit 5 million subscribers today, and he's a university professor worth millions of dollars, is known by and helped improve literally millions of people's lives. I'd say his room is cleaner than most. Huh. I wasn't aware that all one needed was being loved and admired by a lot of people, having the capacity to make a lot of money, and just making an effort to clean your room, even if you don't actually fully do so, to have your room considered clean already. Wonder how this guy feels about somebody like Greta Thunberg. That's exactly what he is saying. Nobody said it was easy. In other words, I am not a god. I find being human difficult sometimes. Oh my. It wasn't easy. That's why his room doesn't have to be fully clean, apparently. He literally said nobody said it was easy. That's literally him acknowledging that he is only a person. Again, somebody please give the man the Nobel Prize in modesty. I hear Peterson doesn't follow his own advice, more often than I hear Peterson gives bad advice. I guess I fail to see how that affects me if I'm focused on improving my own life. Yes, Mr. Hoole. It is perfectly fine to completely ignore someone's blatant hypocrisy as long as you're focused on blindly following orders. Though you should probably take your own advice and stop defending Peterson online and get back to cleaning that room of yours. We love you either way, Dr. JP. And the way I interpret your advice, it's not exclusively in the literal sense. Clean your room is also metaphorical. Fix yourself before you go attempting to change the world. You're changing the world, JP. I'm just going to suggest that Mr. Tabbitt reads those last two lines over and over and over again until he figures out the problem. I'd say messy workplaces are often a sign of an insightful and intelligent mind. Oh God, what the hell? The best kind of clean rooms are the ones that aren't clean at all, actually. What if doing the exact opposite thing that this man I admire so much specifically commanded me to do is actually what he was truly trying to say? God, I love these people. Why do people find it so hard to consider good advice to be valid when the person who gives said advice doesn't follow it to the letter 100% of the time? Well, Mr. Future Farmer, I'm going to go out on the longest of limbs here, but perhaps because the guy offering this advice repeatedly emphasized following it to the letter 100% of the time. But yeah, aside from that, I don't see why anyone would have any issue with it. It amazes me how ruthlessly judgmental people are for things they too have been guilty of before. Like they, with their divine omnipresent abilities, know without a doubt what your life and experience was like, enough to judge it. Zoo animals glazed in dysregulation. Oh yes, more people need to be tolerant and non-judgmental, like Jordan B. Peterson, the paragon of these very virtues. I love this tweet. It's as if none of these people have ever been sick or not felt well, and just summed it on the couch and watched Netflix all day, or porn. But you put these other people up on this pedestal, and they aren't allowed to have bad days or be human. It's insane. Sometimes I wonder if fans of Jordan Peterson have ever actually read or watched literally anything about him. Exactly. I said almost the same thing, that life is suffering. Knowing that doesn't somehow dampen the sting or make you immune to stumbling. We are a consistent work in progress. And also, to top it off from a quote from the great Lobster King himself, I think heaven exists and we can produce it, but we're not going to do that by changing the behavior of other people. Well, Reverend, follow the good doctor's advice and stop trying to tell us not to criticize the Lobster Lord. You don't have to justify yourself about a damn thing. Glad you're feeling better. Refreshing to see some honesty for a change from his fans. Of course he doesn't have to explain himself. That's for us lowly mortals, not the mighty king of the lobsters. I'm reminded of a quote that, while not specifically about people like Peterson, can still apply. And it goes, "Poor people become crazy. The rich, however, are merely eccentric." I think Peterson responded to this pretty succinctly when he said the rule is not never have your room be dirty. The whole point is life can be chaotic and you should remind yourself to tend to what you're immediately responsible for, your own room. And as indicated in other posts, this was when he was suffering from mental health problems and his wife had a 90% chance of dying from cancer. And as I mentioned earlier, those sound like excellent reasons for Peterson to spend more time in his room getting things clean and less time anywhere outside of it. Didn't Nietzsche say some shit like, "Just because I hold the key to your lock does not mean I hold the key to mine"? Look, Peterson's advice is perfect for you filthy leftists. but not remotely for him. I know that's not what this dude was trying to get at, but it was unintentionally the correct answer. But you know what? There's more good news, because technically none of this matters. For you see, if you think about it, in a way, Peterson hasn't engaged in any hypocrisy whatsoever. Because you see, Peterson only argued against changing the world via engagement in politics. But what if I told you that Peterson is not guilty of this because he himself is not engaging in politics?
Look, I've thought for many, many years, decades really, about having a political career. I mean, I was interested in a political career when I was 13. And so every 5 years or so, I've probably revisited that. But every time I revisited, I came to the same conclusion, which was that the work that I was doing that was focused on a philosophy of individual responsibility and trying to identify how that philosophy had emerged in the West over thousands of years was more important than any possible political action could be. And I still don't regard what I'm doing as political in any sense of the word. I think it's philosophical most accurately, and there's an element of it that's theological. So I think it's individual responsibility. And the meaning of life is to be found in the adoption of individual responsibility. And that's what the university should be teaching people.
You see, guys? Problem solved, because there was no problem to begin with. Sure, to the uneducated and the uninitiated, it may seem like Peterson has been involving himself in politics for all these decades. But the truth of the matter is that he was only engaging in the most apolitical thing imaginable. Common sense. What, you think there's any type of long-standing political contention between things like individualism and collectivism? As if that's not one of the main areas of disagreement between the two major political parties in the US, for example? You seriously think that Peterson repeatedly hating on left-leaning politicians like Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden, while also offering support for right-leaning politicians like Doug Ford and Donald Trump, advocating for traditional conservative values and policies against the LGBTQ community and feminism, defending oil companies, and going on programs like Tucker Carlson, Fox and Friends, going on tours with conservative activists like Charlie Kirk, making videos for PragerU, and actively working under right-wing superstar wunderkind Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire, has anything remotely to do with politics? Well, then you just might be a bloody postmodern neo-Marxist, bucko. But hey, you know what? At the end of the day, if somebody who is in Jordan Peterson's current state is somebody who qualifies as having their room completely clean and their house in perfect order, or I guess, at the very least, perfect enough order, then I guess the bar for becoming worthy enough to change the world isn't really that high to begin with. And thus probably not really anything to complain about. Of course, I can't help but wonder of the slightest possibility that Peterson and his fans would require slightly higher standards for the people Peterson criticizes. As for me, I would leave the good doctor with this bit of advice. Something that even he might actually appreciate. The Jorpster loves the Bible, right? Well, I've got a line that's right up his alley. From Luke 4:23. Physician, heal thyself. Anyways, to wrap this up, no doubt Peterson fanboys are not going to take kindly to this video criticizing their crustacean king. If it's anything like previous arguments I've had with Peterson fans, there's going to be primarily 3 groups involved. The first group would argue that if my analysis on Peterson's advice is remotely accurate, then Peterson's advice would be far too stupid for anyone to take seriously. And thus it's obvious that I'm misinterpreting it, perhaps maliciously even, because if it's legitimately stupid advice, then by definition, it cannot be something that Peterson actually advocates, because the great Jordan Peterson himself cannot advocate stupid things. The second group will argue that my analysis is in fact accurate, and you know what? It's a good thing that Peterson is arguing for what he's arguing, actually. Then we have the final group, which oddly enough, believes in both arguments from the previous 2 groups. And hilariously enough, this third group tends to be the largest group of Peterson fans. Don't ask me how that's possible. I'm not sure either, but it just is. So I guess I'll end this by just asking a couple of questions for you guys. Should young conservative activists such as those in Charlie Kirk's Turning Points USA organization that Peterson himself has spoken at stay out of politics, i.e. changing the world while they're still young and naive? And if so, at what point are they allowed to start changing the world? And if not, that it's perfectly fine for them to engage in activism right away, why are they allowed to, but not young left-wing activists? And speaking of which, how is that activism allowed to manifest? Like, are they allowed to engage in protests, or voting, or running for some form of office? Not counting the time spent obviously completely immobilized by his medically induced coma, should Peterson himself have spent more time cleaning his room before resuming his duties on Twitter and YouTube and the like? Should he do that right now, in fact? If not, why not? How does one square Peterson's advice on starting off small and local, yet suggesting to Western feminists to take care of anti-feminist issues in Middle Eastern countries instead? And finally, is it even possible to have a perfectly clean room or house? If not, at what point would it be clean enough to go out and change the world? And if so, what does a perfectly clean room and perfect house look like exactly? Is it an easy task? Or a very difficult one that will take tremendous amounts of time and effort to focus on? And if it's the latter, then what the hell are you doing on here defending Jordan Peterson? Go clean your fucking room. Hey everybody. I'd like to apologize once again for being MIA for yet another very long period of time. It's actually been a rough couple of months, unfortunately. But once again, I'm trying to get back into the groove. That being said, for what it's worth, I wasn't completely loafing about, and this video did in fact take quite a bit of time to create, so I hope you all appreciate it. But it was very difficult and time consuming, and it goes without saying that is by far and away the largest video that I've made on this channel so far, without question. So if you like my content, please donate a couple of bucks to my Patreon. If you can. I hate to say this, but I lost my job a while ago, and unfortunately I haven't been working since. So I'll take all the help that I can get. And as far as my next video, I will do my absolute best to try to have it out in a much more reasonable length of time. Thanks again, and I hope you guys have a great day.